The Alexiad of Anna Comnena was introduced to me some time ago as the first history ever written by a woman. Now, I don't know if that's true or debatable. I would assume it probably is. But we are getting dropped into a very fascinating time period and place that is Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, at the end of the 1000s, beginning of the 1100s, right after a disastrous battle where they lost like most of their army, and there was internal strife and rebellions, and basically Anna Comnena, the Byzantine princess, wanted to write the biography of her father, the Emperor Alexius, who lived during this time period, and she credits with and makes the argument for, that I find pretty compelling, that Alexius held the empire together and is the one who allowed it to survive for what would be, Anna Comnena didn't know this, but what would be another 400 years until the fall of Constantinople, 300 to 400 years. So it is definitely arguable that it would have fallen a lot sooner if it weren't for the competence and the personality, the cleverness of this Emperor Alexius, who is the subject. And Anna Comnena, while she is writing this as a historian and is trying to present this as an objective history, does not shy away from introducing her own personality, her own thoughts about things at times, though she tries to temper it, and is constantly doing her best to maintain some level of objectivity while acknowledging and presenting that she is, above all, a human being, just like all of us and all historians. So, of course, it's not perfect. It's a primary source, but it gives us an incredible insight into that time period. I'm going to talk about a lot of examples today that I've marked in the book. So we'll get a little bit of insight into her life, the Byzantine court, but a lot of the book, you have to know, it is the central figure of her father, Alexius. And I'm going to refer to the empire as the Byzantines throughout this video instead of the Eastern Romans, even if in the book, if you read it, you have to know whenever she says Romans, she's talking about her father and her empire, not the Rome of, Italy, where the Pope is lording his power over most of Europe. So we're talking, I'm just going to use Byzantines, but in the book it is Romans. It's the Eastern Roman Empire. So with that said, let's continue. I want to give sort of a setup. First of all, I think it's important to understand just how bad things were. I think I'll illustrate this with Anna's own words as I go through the book. But it's, in video game terms, if you've ever played Medieval or Medieval 2 Total War and played as the Byzantine Empire on very hard, you will immediately get doom stacks coming at you from all directions, from Sicily, from the north, from the Turks, and they will all declare war on you for literally no reason, and you will have rebellions. Maybe not so much in Medieval 2, but you will have rebellions in your own empire as well that you're dealing with, and people trying to overthrow you, except worse. So it's that situation, except worse. You could not, this is point of collapse. Because I even think in the game they start you with more territory than the Byzantines actually had. They were up to Constantinople, Nicaea or Nicaea, I don't know, we'll go with Nicaea. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but that's the town that basically this was the cutoff point here from what I understand. So it was bad, a bad situation, right? And Anna lived through all this. And we get a sense, too, from the writing that she wasn't actually cooped up and shut away this whole time. She was out there and she was seeing some of this stuff. Her ability to describe siege engines and the Machination, the sort of negotiations and warfare almost gives me the sense that she had much more direct access to this than one might think. She certainly talks about how she's interviewed a lot of people. She probably interviewed generals, but I do get the sense that she was out and about and seeing a lot of some of these events firsthand, especially the ones that are described like in Constantinople. So that's an interesting feature of this book. And there's even moments of the book that she describes like a woman stepping forward and inspiring men into battle by throwing a javelin and stuff. So there's really some kind of contrary to our expectations of a medieval time period. She gives the impression that there is still a lot of sort of academic tradition. There is a lot of references to the Greek playwrights, Homer. In particular, this book opens up with a quote referencing Sophocles, and this is like 3 books I've started and read. I would even say like 4 or 5 books in a row that I've read that have all referenced or mentioned Sophocles. So I've made it as a side project of this to actually start reading some Sophocles as well. And I was really impressed by Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King. Like, wow, that's an amazing play. I had, of course, known about somewhat what it was about, but actually reading it from start to finish, I recommend it. It's just an amazing play. So maybe I'll do a different video on Sophocles soon, as I'm going to keep reading more of the plays that are in my compilation of Greek playwrights that I have, or maybe a video on that whole book itself if I can read enough of the plays. I sort of talked about Aeschylus a little bit in the video that I did about the Iliad, a couple plays of his that I'd read. So I'll link that in the description, I suppose, if I remember. So yeah, let's start talking about the book. Opens again, it gives us a sort of introduction to Alexius, Emperor Alexius's boyhood. Remember, Anna Comnena is writing this in a monastery at the age of 60, compiling a whole bunch of documents, interviewing people, but I don't know if it's true, but I almost get the sense that this work has been going on a lot longer, that she's had the idea of writing this for a much longer period of time. Her father had passed away by the time she's writing this, many years ago, at least 2 decades, I think, if not more. So it's, she's giving us first sort of an introduction to the situation, the world that Alexius has grown up in, and Alexius actually proves himself as a general very young. He's in his teens when he defeats, commanding armies pretty much in his late teens, and defeating some rebellions by his trickery. And so we get an example where, for example, he pretends to blind a rebel leader in front of an audience. He doesn't actually blind this person, but he pretends to, and sort of breaking the spirit of the rebellion by doing this. So he doesn't actually harm anybody, but through this trickery does put the rebellion to rest. So this is the very first example of many in which Alexius is going to show kind of his, you could say underhanded, but I think the way it's put in the introduction here I agree with, is he's more Odysseus than he is an Achilles. Though Anna Comnena tries to show that he's kind of both. And perhaps greater than either. I'm not even kidding. She practically compares her father to Jesus at one point. She really loves her father and really steps out of the sort of objectivity of history at some points in expressing this. Even though at the same time she is self-aware that she's doing this, and reminds us that she is not exaggerating the greatness of her father. He really was this great, or tries to say it that way. So it's her personality comes out a lot as we go on. But as Alexius takes over as emperor, he is quite young. I believe he's in his early 20s. And his mother is actually the one who kind of takes the emperor, the former empress, I guess, is the one who kind of takes over the administrative stuff of Constantinople, while he goes out to stop the Norman invasion. I want to say, who is it? It's Robert. Yeah, this Robert's going to be a really important character. Robert of Lombardy, who is now the king of Sicily. He's controlling big parts of southern Italy. So we get this sort of invasion coming from Sicily that he's got to go right out and stop. And he actually loses some pretty significant battles against this Robert of Lombardy, who, Anna really describes these characters very vividly, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but one of the joys of reading this is how vividly she describes, like her mother, no, not her mother, Alexius's mother, so I guess her grandmother, and her mother, the Empress Irene, how she goes into detailed description, the enemies of Alexius, this Robert guy, some of the Crusaders that are going to come later. So Alexius, he is the emperor that lives during the time of the First Crusade, and we'll see as this goes on, one of the main ways he manages to keep this empire together is by turning his enemies against each other. That's what you do when you're surrounded by enemies. So for example, he loses these great battles against Robert, and actually I say great battles, but the Byzantine army at this point is like so decimated that we're talking like 10,000 at the most, like armies of 10,000, and so he loses most of one army against Robert, and then has to ask the Turkish Sultan for, like, just give me some men, give me anybody we can. And the Turkish Sultan actually sends him 7,000 crack troops. How does he pay for this? Well, there's this whole thing where he and his mother have to make kind of a controversial decision to sell basically artifacts from the churches. Like, they're basically... they're selling like stuff from the churches, like gold and I don't know, idols, or I don't know. But they basically have to raid the churches and the church treasuries to be able to pay for these mercenaries to keep the empire together. I guess if you'd call them mercenaries or borrowed troops from the Turkish Sultan. So it's quite a... That really says a lot about the situation they're in. So eventually Alexius is able to drive back these I guess, Sicilian, I think they're called Normans, because this is the thing about the Anna, is she refers to like all of Westerners as Franks, Celts, Normans, like all this stuff interchangeably, and then she refers to everybody who's east of Constantinople as Turks and Saracens and all different things, right? And then everybody north, I'm pretty sure, are the Scyths, the Scyths. So it's just, it's everybody. She just lumps everybody together by geographic region without real regard to difference in culture. So that's just something, but at this point, it kind of like fits. It kind of fits to the situation that the Byzantines are in, just being totally surrounded by enemies from within, from without. And all this time, there's like conspiracies going on in the courts, and Alexius throughout his life is having to return to Constantinople to put down conspirators. Anna always tries to show him as like magnanimous towards his enemies. There aren't too many examples of where he will like put somebody to death, but somebody who needs to be put to death or imprisoned will be it will be done so, but by somebody else, not by the emperor's direct hand. So there is, and she shows herself too to be kind of like, I think in some ways compassionate herself, and kind of horrified, for example, by this. The Byzantines, they really love their blinding. So many people get blinded in this book, and especially at the beginning. Like the first 6 chapters, it feels like every few pages somebody is getting their eyes put out. Yeah, it's a thing, and I never realized that was such a big thing, I guess. But for the Byzantines, yeah. Another thing about the Byzantine Empire we get in this book, something very characteristic, is how just kind of you get a sense of this very old empire, this old East Roman Empire with all of these bureaucracies, all of these, you know, traditions, and they're living amongst this old wealth, these rich churches, these rich palaces. Constantinople is still a rich city, and it's a trading hub, but at the same time collapsing. You know, you get a sense of just this, like there's this simultaneous feeling of like apocalyptic, but also this great, I don't know, this great civilization, the shadow of a great civilization continues lumbering forward. And I guess that's where we sort of get the word Byzantine meaning something labyrinthine, or you know, because there's this complexity to it. It's this complex structure that's sort of lumbering its way forward through history in this slow decline. And you know, the word Byzantine, of course, it's like, I guess what it evokes is this labyrinthine thing that is also not very effective, right? It's kind of just this, it's old, but it ties somewhere into the deep past too. And so, yeah, let's move on from that theme. But you know, I want to highlight that because you do get a sense of that in this book, and it's not. There are parts of the book that are extremely dry history. Okay, I'm going to say especially like after Robert is defeated, that there are some parts that do really drag on. You get especially the war against the Siths. So in chapters 7 and 8, I want to say, it gets to the point where it's like, okay, yeah, these are almost skippable chapters. Like, he goes north, he fights, he drives off the Siths. Okay, now you can move on to the more interesting stuff about the Crusaders. Like, I read them, but there isn't a lot of, like, memorable stuff in that chapter, and so I feel like I read them rather quickly without a whole lot. But here's the thing. That makes this history much more convincing because you get the monotony of warfare. Warfare in this book is often monotonous. It's not fun. It's not glorious. It is often, these are wars of attrition, where you're just trying to keep the enemy from conquering. You're not, you know, this is defensive warfare that Alexius is fighting through this whole book, and he's not winning these glorious battles most of the time. He's pulling strings, he's making alliances, he's turning one enemy against the other. And that is his, you know, that's what you have to do to keep this thing alive, is what he's saying. And Anna really tries also to make him seem a virtuous person, as I think I've mentioned in all this, to try to, and yet his personality is somehow rather elusive behind sort of Anna's adoration of him. It's almost like the other characters in the book are the ones that come to the forefront, where that are not, you know, she does a good job of making her father seem like this larger than life figure that nobody else could have ever done what she did. It's very convincing, I think. Not saying that that's necessarily true, but it shows the depth of sort of the love that she has for her father, I think. And that it's really coming from a sincere place, and we really do get that coming out towards the end as well. So I had all these things marked. I'm actually rambling a lot more in this video than I thought I'd be. I thought I'd be reading more straight from. So yeah, I'm gonna try to go through these parts that I've marked in the book and try to kind of, you know, decide what's worth reading on the spot here out loud. Here, in her own words, she describes how bad the situation is. This is in book 3. There are 15 books, you know, in quotation marks, books. Alexius knew that the empire was almost at its last gap. The east was being horribly ravaged by the Turks. The west was in a bad condition, while Robert strained every nerve to put on the throne the pseudo-Michael who had taken refuge with him. And that refers to, yeah, so Robert, the reason Robert of Sicily or of Italy decided to invade the Byzantine Empire is, well, he was looking for any excuse, but that excuse was his wife was the daughter of a previous Byzantine emperor who had been overthrown. One of the worst they ever had, according to Anna and other historians, I think. And so he had a fake deposed emperor who was pretending to be that emperor basically give him the encouragement he needed to go and invade. I'm simplifying that a little bit, but I thought it really illustrates how messed up the politics are and are shown to be in this book. So, but that's the situation. Enemies on all sides. Yeah, there is really a lot of things in this book that I had kind of thought maybe I would read, but I think a lot of it I've expressed pretty well actually in just the sort of rambling I did. Just getting there's like one part where she in book 6 where she goes on a tangent about mathematics and astrology. No, the art of divination. Yeah, so. A certain mathematician called Seth, who boasted loudly of his knowledge of astrology, had foretold Robert's death. Yes, Robert will die. And one interesting thing about this conflict between Robert and Alexius, Alexius at the time of this war is in his 20s, Robert is nearly 80, or in his 70s. So there is like this considerable age difference between these two men who are fighting. And yeah, Robert eventually dies with the help of a Venetian navy actually takes him down, and then he gets sick, and so it's again just the turning enemies against each other. And how did he pay the Venetians? Well, he paid them, but the greatest reward that the Venetians got out of helping the Byzantines against this Sicilian king was free trade. No duties on any trade, no taxes on any trade that the Venetians would make in Byzantine territory. So that, if you know anything about the history of Venice, is pretty significant, I think. So anyway, back to the astrology ramble. You have this, she goes on, the art of divination is a rather recent discovery unknown to the ancient world. And she goes on, and so back to astrology, we get this whole ramble about how it's an ancient art and so on, and that her father actually, that in the reign of her father, many sciences made progress, and includes the art of divination as one of them. So I just thought that was kind of an amusing sort of passage. And she says there is no magic in this whatsoever, but merely a certain numerical skill on the part of the Alexandrian, referring to a mathematician named Seth, who flourished with his research on divination and accurately predicted the death of Robert, that enemy of Alexius. So I don't know. I just thought it was really amusing, and. I mean, it gives you a sense of like, how you can have, okay, and I don't mean to be like making fun of this so much. I mean, it is amusing, but like sometimes very complex sciences that might have a lot of elements of true things can be built based upon false premises. And I could say like a lot of theology kind of falls into this category. Like you can build really complex structures on false premises. We do all the time. We build civilizations on them. So it's just a really interesting to think about. Again, I'm not here trying to argue the merits of science versus religion. Which sometimes I've thought about or said things in the past, but I am simply observing. I'm observing this sort of feature. Okay, so let's continue. We have that Scythian War. I kind of said what I needed to about that, which is. It really is kind of an interlude of the book. We have like heretics. She describes a few heretics in this book in particular, creating heresies against sort of the Eastern Orthodox religion, that this really becomes a big deal because they start generating a lot of followers, and Emperor Alexius does feel himself obligated in many of these cases to settle these heresies. There's one early on that he does by peaceful means, and he's merciful to this particular heretic, Diogenes, I'm not sure. And this is a very smart guy who loses his temper often, and kind of just a passionate intellect gone awry as they see him. But in the end, a pretty smart guy. And so later on, after he renounces his heresies, Diogenes actually makes some great contributions to geometry and music later in his life. So these kinds of episodes that Anna kind of talking about these sort of characters that inhabit sort of the Constantinople or the Byzantine Empire is really interesting stuff, I think. And it's all over in this book. You just kind of do have to get through some of those parts that get into real military detail that can be a bit monotonous for sure. Let's see, all kinds of guarantees. We've got, moving pretty fast through this, when the Crusaders show up, that gets really interesting because most of the Crusaders are like very detestable and barbaric people in the eyes of Anna, and I would argue she implies even her father, even though her father has much more patience with these rude barbarians from the West than she does. And but her father is really essentially using the Crusaders to reconquer lands to the east. So he uses the Crusader armies, and he does this very effectively, to reclaim a lot of Byzantine lands in what is now modern-day Turkey, even up to Antioch, reclaiming that from the Crusaders eventually in some wars that happen even after the First Crusade, after Jerusalem has been conquered. The massacre that the Crusaders commit in Jerusalem is not detailed, but it is mentioned, and I remember reading the primary sources of that when I was younger and being quite shocked. And it's really interesting because reading the primary sources from the Crusader, the Western perspective when I was younger, and now reading it from sort of the Byzantine, the central perspective, like they're just trying to keep their empire together, right? And then kind of what has to follow, I think, is reading some sources from the Eastern perspective. So I think that's something to look for in the future. I don't know when. But yeah, so the First Crusade here detailed from the point of view of the Byzantines and the struggle with Bohemond. Bohemond is really the crusading noble from Western Europe that really gives the most headache to Alexius. And there's some entertaining stories regarding Bohemond and him putting himself in a coffin to escape a siege, I think is what happens. He puts himself in a ship in a coffin and with even like a dead chicken inside, and she's saying like only a Frank, that's what she calls them a lot, Franks and Celts. Only a Frank could put up with such ridiculous and horrible conditions to achieve an end. So yeah, we get more conspiracies, man. The conspiracies don't stop. Byzantine politics are just a mess. Yeah, the emperor does finally defeat Bohemond. He comes out very well at the end of all this, but just never stops fighting. You get the sense like we get contrary statements from Anna about this. She says that at the same time that she says her father loved war, loved the heat of battle, right? And talks about even his exploits of charging into battle, which he does even as an older man. In his final and probably greatest victory against the Turkish Sultan at the end, to maintain his lands, to maintain the lands won in the First Crusade. That's kind of his final battle. And a lot of this, you know, you can imagine if there were a film made of this guy's life, I'm sure it would be very exciting with lots of big battle scenes and stuff, you know. I don't know if anyone ever has, but I didn't actually look that up. But it just never stops. So at the same time, Anna says that her father is very like peace loving, and he's compassionate to his enemies, and he's very reasonable and just wants, you know, he doesn't indulge in leisure time, but he does read when he can. He's a well-read man, but then also he loves the heat of battle. So there's this sort of, it's a contradictory personality, but I think, you know, everybody is in some ways. So it makes sense. And I think actually these contradictions, when we read contradictions about historical people, that to me makes them more real rather than less real, because we often behave in very contradictory ways throughout our life. The book, I actually think that the Alexiad of Amna Comnena, the last 3 chapters, are the most engaging and well written and most interesting chapters in the book, because not only does more of Anna's feelings and personality come out, and I think that's because we're getting closer to the time that she remembers most recently. It's really compelling stuff. Just she describes the passing away of her father in incredible detail, in a lot of emotion, as she's there at his side. You know, as her father is dying with the Empress, his wife, and it's her mother. So it's just a really touching scene, and even the final lines are actually quite impactful, because she says, you know, after talking about the grief that she went through, "Let this be the end of my history then, lest as I write of these sad events, I become more embittered." And there's a really interesting footnote in my edition. For the most part, the footnotes are really great, and there's also these additional numbers on the top of pages which correspond to a timeline in the back of the book, so I really recommend you use those if you're having trouble finding your way through the book. But there's an interesting footnote here that I don't really disagree with, because she's lamenting here the death of her husband, Nicephorus Bryennius, who she almost could have become emperor through at this time, but her little brother John, who she allegedly conspired with Alexius's wife, her mother, to kill, he became the emperor, and we don't really know that. A lot of this comes from their sources, from their side of things, before they sent them into exile. So, well, anyway, what the author or the editor of this is arguing in the footnotes is that one could hardly regard 3 such bereavements in the course of some 20 years as a crushing blow. Like, come on, I don't know, like, it's not that hard for me to imagine somebody still grieving, I don't know, a father or a husband 20 years later. Like, no, I think these feelings are really sincere, though. She is at a monastery, and she admits that she does not want to become more embittered thinking about these things, and she might be bitter about some things, but I don't know. I just found that particular footnote rather disingenuous and provoked a strong reaction from me. In an otherwise great, amazing edition. I think, anyway, I really love the Alexiad of Anna Comnena. I didn't read as much straight from the book as I thought I would. I made like all of these notes that I was going to read stuff from, but you know, sometimes maybe that was just preparation for me to express it a little bit more openly and fluently, but I don't know. I love the Alexiad of Anna Comnena. more for, like, I'm not even somebody who nowadays really I don't know, I'm not interested in constructing a narrative of history together for my own needs to try, like, I think trying to find some kind of, like, I don't know, coherent narrative in the entire history of humankind is always going to be nearly, I don't know, so reductive that it's useless. Though A Little History of the World by Ernst Gombrich does a really fantastic job of actually doing it and telling an entertaining story. But in the end, I'm not sure how much more useful it can be. I could be wrong, but what I'm trying to say here is what I really go to history for is to connect with, to get dropped into a time and place, a person, Anna Comnena, right? And to be with her in the monastery as she's writing this, and remembering a whole life that she's lived, and her father, and the things that her father achieved to keep the Byzantine Empire together. Once again, a very flawed person. There are times where she rambles, or just like me, or her writing has these sort of tics that I find kind of charming that come across in translation. So, like, there are so many times where she'll say, so much for so-and-so, or so much for that, so much for that. But it's charming. It's a personality that comes out. And towards the end of the book, there's a really engaging story about another heretic who actually ends up getting burned at the pyre. And the book practically ends with the burning of a heretic leader, which there's this whole scene that's really fascinating, where she and her mother are, like, pleading for the lives of some other heretics, and I might be getting some scenes mixed here, but it ends by just this guy getting basically thrown into the fire, and then of course the passing away of Alexius. But that's, like, kind of the final event that marks his life, and is a very strange thing. And actually, I'm so glad I remembered that, because that reminds me there's one part that I really have to read. And just to, like, give you, I don't know, I actually think this is one of my favorite passages in the entire book. I'm not even 100% sure that it was this one, but I'm going to read it. Yeah, it was. This is one of them. Such was the end of this episode. And this is after he defeats the Turks. So his final battle, basically, his final victorious battle against the Turks to maintain the land that he won with the Crusaders, using the Crusaders. Such was the end of this episode. Constantinople was rife with stories of the emperor's exploits. Chance had indeed involved him in difficult situations, prejudicial both to himself and the interests of the empire, so that he was wholly surrounded by a host of troubles. Yet every one of them was thwarted and opposed by his virtues, his vigilance, his energy. Of all the emperors who preceded him, right down to the present day, not one had to grapple with the affairs so complicated, with the wickedness of men at home and abroad, of so many types as we have seen in the lifetime of this man. Maybe it was destined that the Roman people should suffer tribulation with God's permission, for I would never attribute our fate to the movements of the stars. She said, that note aside in parentheses, she's saying, like, it was so bad that there is no way that chance could have ever produced such a ridiculously bad situation. And that tells us something too about the view on life. We're not in the Middle Ages where, even in the royalty, there's this cynical view of life as, like, this horrible place, right? And there's many times in this book talking about people who died before their time, when they died in their 20s. It's not like we're in this age where everybody's just dying at, a young age or something like that. So, I mean, I'm not saying, like, necessarily it was better in those days, but it's not kind of as bad as sometimes people imagine it. But of course, we are hearing this from a princess, right? An upper class woman, very as upper class as you can possibly get. So, take that too. But I do find her approach to be rather level-headed, and again, I don't think she was somebody that was completely sheltered by. I don't get that impression from a lot of the stories she tells, even about and she doesn't talk about peasants or anybody with disrespect. In fact, she was, I believe, for a time in charge of this place called the orphanage, and the development of this orphanage happens in wake of this final battle where people are fleeing kind of from the Turks, and Alexius builds this basically little town kind of thing that's for people who need help. And so she and her mother and like the Byzantine royal family that she's part of, she tries to make a point to say, like, we have really tried to be charitable to the people and to be good rulers, and to be compassionate Christians. This is there's this strong sort of sense of virtue to it, I'm actually convinced that she and her family were far more Christian than those who came on the Crusades that they had to deal. I'm very much won over to her side on this, I guess. So let me continue. Perhaps Roman power declined to this decadence through the folly of previous rulers. That's her alternative explanation, which, yeah. Certain it is that in my father's reign great disorders and wave on wave of confusion united to afflict our affairs. For the Cis from the north, the Celts from the west, and the Ishmaelites from the east were simultaneously in turmoil. There were perils, too, from the sea, not to mention the barbarians who dominated it, or the countless pirate vessels launched by wrathful Saracens and sent to battle by ambitious Vetones. The latter regarded the Roman Empire with hostile eyes, and all men looked upon it with envy. She says it's envy that they come for the Byzantine lands. The Romans lording it over other peoples are naturally hated by their subjects. Whenever they find an opportunity, all of them by land or sea flock from all quarters to attack us. In the old days before our time, there was a great buoyancy about the empire, which is lacking today. The burden of government was not so heavy. That's an interesting statement. In the old days, before our time, there was a great buoyancy about the empire, which is lacking today. The burden of government was not so heavy. But in my father's reign, as soon as he acceded the throne, a veritable flood of dangers poured in on him from everywhere. And she kind of goes on to repeat, But she writes further on here, I am not writing the history of things that happened 10,000 years ago, but there are men still alive today who knew my father and tell me of his deeds. They have in fact made not inconsiderable contribution to this history for once reported or recalled to the best of his ability one fact, while another told me something else, but there was no discrepancy in their accounts. So, yeah, there's so much to talk about in this book, but that's what these rambly videos are for. So, there's one part in the book, and the sense of time scale, okay? So there's a part in the book that I think is, again, toward the end here, that I think is rather symbolic, where like I can't remember if it was like a storm or a rock slide or an earthquake or something, that a statue of Constantine, the great Constantine, falls over. And I was like, wow, it contributes like so artistically and symbolically, even though this is real, but the fact that Anna chose this event to include as this orphanage is being set up, thinking of this orphanage as a refuge for people, that the East Roman Empire, the way they saw themselves was this refuge of civilization with all these envious barbarians coming around to attack them. And I'm not comparing any of this to the people who compare like the end of the Roman Empire to America today. I'm not going that direction with this, but one can imagine like in a future post-apocalyptic United States where you have this sort of like say Chicago becomes like a nucleus, its own empire, right? And then outside of that, you just have these sort of tribes that are invading it from all directions. And Chicago is now calling itself America, it's like it is America or something. And then You know, I played too much Fallout New Vegas. That's the whole moral of that story. But yeah, this idea of time scale. There's the weight of history collapsing on itself is what the Byzantine Empire is. And there's a part where they're in the war in Turkey when Alexius finds some like ditches dug 500 years ago, like big canals basically dug 500 years ago by an emperor 500 years ago, and he uses these same canals inspire him in a military tactic. Like this sense of like that even back then there was this sense of scale in time, and there were just these marked like legends that carried on, and maybe that's where a lot of our history is coming from. But you know, I'm just reveling in how amazing it is, and you reading this book, I hope you can revel in it too. And I've probably gone on long enough here, but there's just one thing leads to another, and there's so much in this book I want to share. But yeah, just read it. The Alexiad of Anna Comnena is, to me, one of the greatest things I've read, just by its very virtue of having come to us from the deep time, and again, not feeling alone in history. And many princesses have lived. Not all of them, very few of them, in fact, have written such an incredible work, even in homage, to their father or whatever it is, but just a work that gives us a window into that time period and the thinking, and again reminds us we're not alone. And once again, amazing, just great props to the translator, E.R.A. Suter, translated from the Greek. Yeah, incredible stuff. So seems like a good place to stop. The Alexiad of Anna Comnena. We'll see you next time on Mike Reads the World.